Hello, selectors, and welcome back to the Life Burst Podcast. We're talking about the decks of set 9, and Aya Tempo and just some tempo decks in general are the last thing that we really need to cover. So tempo decks basically do this sort of thing where they expedite their own game plan while trying to hinder you at the same time, well, hinder the opponent at the same time. And so Aya, I think, is probably one of the premier tempo decks of the format. You're going to see a bunch of different decks, though, like Umir, maybe even Yuka, which are similar to this one. And then I think there's some Carnival decks, too, that could potentially be used as well that are pretty good. But, like, it's the idea is sort of the same. There's really only two different tempo decks that really exist. There's sort of this blue-black one and blue-white one, and there's sort of a red, black, blue, some kind of mix of that Grixis coloring around each other. The first one is this blue-white one, right, which focuses a lot off of enter starving the opponent and hyper discarding them, right? You strip them of their resources an incredible amount, so that way they have limited options to use against you. And then you do things that are just like beneficial for you, so probably drawing a lot of cards, enter charging, that type of stuff. And I think the sort of like a quintessential one is Aya, right? Aya's got this ability of being able to hyper discard the opponent or draw cards on your own, while simultaneously, basically flipping your opponent's Signy over, never letting them have that Signy back. And the flipping over means that it's basically not giving the opponent resources to work with. Yuka Dijon is also a really good one here, where it's like it's target signaling the opponent's field can't attack, and then at the end of this turn, you get to return to your Elrig deck to replay it again, unless the opponent pays one or discards a card. Normally, they'll always discard a card or pay one, but basically, a free grow that allows you to tax your opponent is still pretty damn good. But all this taxing adds up to two really powerful effects, right? Like Madoka Break, which basically can bottom deck two Signies on the opponent's field for 5. It's expensive, but very powerful. And then Can't Stop Pretty, which they can discard 3 cards, but generally speaking, they won't have that 3 cards, and you can down a Signy just basically for free, more or less, 1 enter, and you can kind of control their pacing of the game. And that's sort of what the Aya decks do. The Umir decks, these Yuka decks are going to do something similar. Basically, they're all just going to try to do something where they're stressing your enter while simultaneously forcing discard out of your hand. Right, I actually need to take out that one card there real quick, because whoopsies, I need to make it publicly available. So let me do that real quick here. It's up pretty. 09, confirm. All right, now it's publicly available for everyone to see. Basically, the accumulation of your plan is going to be early game stuff like discarding with Mana Min, and then late game stripping them of resources like Yukimi, which basically vanishes things and gets rid of them completely. Another one is Gate Ball. So you're going to see sort of like this type of structure on all of it. It's very much 1-2 punch. It's very clear what it's doing. But it can be very powerful against certain types of decks. The issue is a lot of the power comes from opponents not being super familiar with how to play against tempo, and if you navigate that sea pretty well, you actually put yourself in a pretty good position. The first and foremost thing is you can stop Madoka Break by just having like 2 cards in hand. It just makes it awkward for the Madoka Break to go off. You don't have to have the full 4. The full 4, I mean, is preferred, but you can kind of mess around with them, pace out your discard to be, or your drawing cards to be really slow against them, and then you'll always have some amount of cards. This is also pretty weak to aggro pressure, which is why there's so many Exias in the deck, just to keep it so that way it stays afloat versus aggro. And also, it's pretty blue intensive in terms of its enter. There's a lot of white cards here. There's about a fourth of white card deck. So it is difficult. The reason why Aya ends up being the sort of better tempo deck is tempo requires quite a bit of resources to really keep afloat all the time, aka hyper making your opponent run out of resources while simultaneously flooding yourself with resources. And the coins actually help out quite a lot. You get 4 of them immediately. So the coins help out quite a lot with mitigating that, which is why I think Aya ends up being sort of the best version of it. After that, you have, I think, actually, Carnival is a really, really good tempo deck waiting to happen. Actually, this is the list that I've got in front of me that top aided in the most recent GP. I think it's got some cool stuff going for it. Um, and it has basically Carnival is kind of an interesting L rig. Almost every red L rig, with maybe the exception of Hirana 1.0, is a fairly aggro card. Even the Hirana 1.0 card is quite aggro, but it could be mid range. Um, Carnival TI is actually kind of tempo-y or mid-rangey. It's not aggro in the slightest, right? You get this ability where you can discard a card from your hand, and when the L-Rig attacks, you get to choose one of the following. You can either draw a card, enter charge 1, or put a Signy on the opponent's field into the trash, which is strangely very white and blue and green effects, really. So it's really color pie breaking. And then the shrinking of Signies and vanilling them down is also pretty white. So you end up with this L rig that has a lot of good white L rig hallmark staples into it, but gives you access to red, which means that you can actually do some. One of the things that these white blue decks struggle with is they don't really have a lot of ways to open up damage. And by virtue of having red opens up a lot of damage, right? So there's combos in this type of deck where you can give two things negative, or you can give two things to make them power 10,000, and then you can give them negative 10 like 1,000, and that'll just kill them. And then you've got like other things too, like Alius Perluke is really good with specifically Carnival, because the card that you would normally discard, aka going to card advantage, now you gain card advantage because you put it onto the field. It gives you the coins to make the opponents discard stuff, and giving negative 2,000 and freezing something actually kills it when you're also dealing with what do you call it, with the effect from here where you make 2 servant zeros, right? So the other cool thing about this is Carnival often is going to want to make use of the most powerful part is actually probably put the Signy on the opponent's field into the owner's trash when it attacks. So you do that, and then with this you also probably freeze something else, right? And that means the opponent's going to be left with a trash Signy, a frozen Signy, so it's not any use, and maybe something else, which is a really good way to stall out their resources. Now, this deck particularly is a little bit more aggressive than I would normally do, but I wanted to feature it anyways because it did top 8 at the GP. But it does stress the opponent's resources quite a bit, and also give itself its own resources, right? Things like Hakat, Hyacinth, Paraluke, all of these cards give themselves resources to work with. Even Umir gives itself good filtering resources. These Life Bursts actually draws you 3 cards and undoes a lot of discard stuff. So a lot of that stuff does give you a lot of good resources. But then there's a lot of stuff here that's tricky for the opponent to deal with, right? Like Kazuko can give negative 3,000 onto things, which is tricky. Aliu can give negative 2,000. When you want to go with Double Crush here, this is actually quite a versatile card. It could bait out a lot of L-Rigs just on its own. So that can be a cool one to just use. But Halbert as a one of even is kind of an interesting option here because it like forces the opponent into weird situations, but probably the strongest one is Diabride. Diabride forces the opponents into very weird situations where they have to burn their own enter. So like I said, I think this is more like a tempo light. I have my own version that I like to use here. And actually this is the wrong version. Let me pull up the right version. Carnival. I called it mid-range, but I actually don't think it's mid-range. I think it's tempo, but it's a little blendy here, where it has a fair amount of discard in it. It's got a bit of a discard package here. The 4 Monoman, the 1 Bruno, the 3 here, and the random drains also discard, while simultaneously we can stress their enter with things like Diabride. And actually Yuzuki also kind of stresses their enter. And then we can also do stuff that's pretty resource gaining for us. So for example, this just sort of makes us immune to fellow discard, and gains us some resources on that front. This is free removal effects, for example. This is a lot more good removal that just helps us out. But the real ability of gaining resources comes from Tamago, which will allow us to draw a bunch of cards, and draw even more cards. This helps fuel the Carnival's effects. Carnival is really card intensive and a little enter intensive in general as a deck. So Tamago being a cheap way to just gain access to a bunch of cards really helps out. He also had a good version of this as well, which is the Nanashi. So Nanashi can gain cards and also enter charge here, and that's a good way to sort of like help with Carnival's weaknesses on that front. I like green just because I specifically like Mel Burst, Mel Invisible. Just a really good way to basically just keep yourself going for a little longer. But then you've got Energy Door. Energy Door makes you a lot more resilient to just damage, and all of these things can do things like hinder your opponent or help you. And Ancient Echo is actually a really interesting one when you've got this coloring combination, because you can basically, you vanish something, you draw cards, all these things are really good, but that actually, the plus 3,000 power does matter, because it allows you to overrun some stuff, but more importantly, allows you to beat black decks that you wouldn't normally have the out to beating on these things. I think there's some more refining that can be done with this. Maybe dropping the green and going for white instead on here. I think Carnival is not a fully explored Elrig yet, and I'd like to see more people be messing with them. But yeah, anyways, these are the tempo decks that I think are currently in the format, and that's pretty much everything right now that's in the format that you guys can be using. So thank you for watching, commenting below, and I'll see you on the next one.